A little bit of a hectic day here. Sorry for that odd start, but welcome everyone. I am pleased to welcome back one of my very favorite guests, Mr. David Hawkins of Abel Danger. David, how are you?
I'm very well, Jason. Thank you for having me on your show.
It's lovely to see you as always, David. And today, of course, we're going to be talking about Serco's Four Horsemen and the North Tower of the World Trade Center and everything that happened on 9/11. You're always drilling into facts and details and looking at different patents. I'm fascinated by your investigation process. So what have you prepared for us today?
Well, as you know, I've been breaking up crime scene analysis into mens rea, which is the hunt for the guilty mind, which is where we all tend to go first, because we'd like to think that the people we dislike are responsible for some crime. That, I believe, has to be resisted, and we are much more usefully engaged if we focus, before looking at the mens rea, on what in law is known as the actus reus, the facts of the case. And of course, your show, or you talk about crowdsourced the truth, and I think your objectives and my objectives and Abel Danger objectives align very well. And of course, the truth is an interesting concept, because at crime scenes you can say, well, there's good and evil present. You can say there's guilty and innocent present. You can say right and wrong is present. And every one of those fields of inquiry is fascinating in its own right, and that's where we often like to go. Truth and falsehood are actually much more technical issues. And when you arrive at a crime scene, or if an investigator arrives at a crime scene, and the beauty of being online is that we can go into any crime scene anywhere, anytime,
Right.
at our leisure, without actually leaving, in my case, a sub-basement, in your case, that very nice looking studio. Because, just as an example, and this isn't a digression, if I wanted to look at the facsimile of the coroner's report of the murder of the man who wrote Dr. Faustus, Christopher Marlowe, in Deptford, I can look at the facsimile in Latin, because that's what the coroner wrote in, and that would be dated 1593. And it would describe why eventually the killers were let off, etc., etc. Well, that's over, what, 300-400 years ago, and just like 911, we can go back into the records and get some really original information and photographs that are very telling about the facts of the issue, right? Now, we know that the building came down in its own footprint at nearly free fall with gravity.
Yeah.
So I've started looking at what organizations are capable of pulling off the different aspects of the demolition of the North Tower, and using this analysis of the patent office. And the beauty of a patent is it's written in a very dry language, very technical, but it basically describes the state of the art at the time the patent was applied for or published. And it doesn't talk about guilty minds or right or wrong. And in fact, if your listeners want to go into this patent about the biological bullet,
Yes.
there's the most incredible description of what this biological bullet might do and the advantages thereof, including, for example, being able to track well, they don't actually say terrorist, but someone who's been shot with a bullet that contains, I don't know, radioactive polonium, gives you the great benefit you can track them through an airport screening process just by following the radioactivity. And I think of that and I think, wow, isn't that amazing to have that bold statement of a benefit of a bullet, that you can actually track someone who's been shot with a bullet that contains radioactive material. And then what I think I've done, and that's apropos of the title that you've given today's show, Serco's Four Horsemen. You're probably familiar, and I had to check exactly what the names. You've heard of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse,
Yes.
right? Let me see if I can remember. There's war and famine. I think there's poverty and one other thing. But if we go into the patent office, we can see apropos of
Death.
the 9/11 attack, death. All right, so death, war, famine, and
Pestilence.
poverty. Is that right?
Pestilence, I think.
Oh, pestilence. Oh,
Well,
well,
they
that's
say
good. Good.
theologians and popular culture differ on the four horsemen. The four riders are often seen as symbolizing conquest or pestilence, less frequently the Christ or the Antichrist, and then war, famine, and death.
Ah, so it's conquest or pestilence. So I think in the British Empire, we'd probably focus on conquest, wouldn't we?
Right.
and, and then be propagating pestilence, like HIV and Ebola around the world through these very sophisticated research laboratories
Wow.
apparently set
Yeah.
up by Victor Rothschild. So it depends on your point of view, I guess. Anyway, so we all know, I think most of us know what this term SWAT means. A SWAT team is a Special Weapons and Tactics teams.
Yes.
So over the last weeks or so, I've been looking at other groups of SWAT teams in the custody of the perpetrators of the attack of 9/11, to which we could attribute a name and a head person, let's say male or female. And I think we found four families of SWAT teams that might be associated with the four horsemen of the apocalypse.
Wow.
And the first one is Con Air. And when you think about Con Air, very conveniently created by Field McConnell's sister, Christine Marcy, back in 1995. When you think about it, if I wanted to send a SWAT team anywhere in the world at short notice, without keeping the killers, let's say, on my payroll, why wouldn't I park them in a jail system somewhere, either a private jail or a public jail, drug them up, not necessarily drug them up, maybe they're perfectly happy to be psychopaths without any drugs in them, and then store them there and then say, look, in a couple of days, let's say there's a big jail up at BC called Matsqui, which is just across from not the Abbotsford Airport, the Abbotsford International Airport. So it's a high security or medium security jail. There's men and women there that have done various things. Some have committed murder, some are pedophiles, some are thieves, some are robbers, some are just extortionists, etc. But a wonderful team of talent for, let's say, if I wanted to make a movie like The Dirty Dozen, right?
Well, it reminds me of that recent film, The Suicide Squad.
I haven't seen that. What was that?
Well, it's like an offshoot of Batman, where they take all the Batman villains out of jail and turn them into this elite squad in exactly the way that you're describing, and they go fight some alien villain or whatever.
Right. Well, in the 1990s, Janet Reno, Jamie, I like to pronounce her name Gorlick, but I think she prefers it to be pronounced Gorelick.
Yeah.
The woman who put the stovepipes between the CIA and the FBI, and Christine Marcy, and Jamie Gorlick was Christine Marcy's boss. I asked Field the other day what was the increase in incarcerated prisoners during the 90s. He didn't know, but I think it's about 500,000. So at the beginning of the 90s, they had 500,000 Americans in jail. By the end of the 90s, the year before the 9/11 attack, they had 1 million. Well, with 1 million prisoners, you could recruit anyone you like, right, to put together a SWAT team, let's say a Con Air SWAT team, tell them that you're going to pick them up on the 10th of September, let's say hypothetically it might have been at Matsqui Jail up in BC, and you're going to take them by Con Air, or its full name is the United States Justice Prisoner and Alien Transportation System, and fly them down to New York and give them uniforms for the ACE elevator team that were the mechanics, that the words of the journalist, I believe, that scattered like cockroaches when those buildings were being demolished. So inside those two buildings, you had, I think, 85 employees of ACE elevators of Palisades, New Jersey, who were actually maintaining or testing or liquidating the elevators. So that's a wonderful SWAT team to have available if you want to bring the towers down and destroy all the evidence.
But David, don't we have reason to believe that the company Securicom, which was headed up by Marvin Bush for many years, was doing the security upgrades to the building and used some form of paint on nanothermite to rig the buildings for destruction?
Well, I don't think, well, if you can demonstrate with some facts that that is the case, but the beauty of the ACE elevator team is that they upgraded the elevators. And I think their word was the most aggressive upgrade in elevator history, which is a wonderful word when you think that what those elevators did, right? But I think they called it Elevator Times. There's a magazine that came out with a story, I think it was around March of 2001, that this outfit, Ace Elevators, had completed the most aggressive upgrade of any elevators ever in the Twin Towers. And I think there were 6 elevators in each tower that went from the bottom to the top of the building in one go. That is, they didn't stop off at the sky lobby. And that upgrade, very interestingly, was given to a no-name, well, it was given a name, Ace Elevators, but in the annals of elevator upgrades, you would normally give that to a company like Otis, which has obviously got the technology and the experience and the record to do that kind of thing. So Ace Elevators, I believe, had about 6 months of access to the elevator shafts in those twin towers. And continuing on with our analysis, we discovered that there's a particular formulation of elevator insulation that is based on a product from Alcoa or Arconic. And incidentally, Arconic was the company that provided the Rayno-Bond polyethylene cladding at the Grenfell Tower fire. I don't know if you remember that in London, there was a tower where the thing went up in flames so fast it killed about 200 people. They couldn't evacuate. So if I want to blow up the Twin Towers, and remember going back to Con Air and Christine Marcy, the man who tried to blow up the Twin Towers in 1993 was a man called Ramzi Youssef, Y-U-S-E-F. And afterwards he said, well, give me more money and I'll bring them down next time.
Did Youssef say that?
Yes, he did.
What about that sheik in Jersey City who was somehow linked to Ramzi Youssef, the blind sheik?
Well, that gives a bit of a problem for rigging up elevators with explosives if he's blind.
But he was somehow the spiritual leader of these guys, right?
Well, again, the interesting thing about that is a classic example, and I'm not pointing the finger, of going over to the mens rea. That is to say, if he's the spiritual leader, it's irrelevant in terms of whether or not they put this Arconic insulation in the elevator shafts that was designed so you had 2 sheets of aluminum. I'll give it the American pronunciation. We Brits normally say aluminium, but I guess Field has always given me trouble. So since you're in New York, I'll call it aluminum, right? So you have 2 sheets of aluminum, which is sandwiching a polyethylene layer, which is not flame resistant. So what went into the Grenfell Tower in London was cladding on the outside of the building, where you have 2 sheets of aluminum and polyethylene interior, which is a kind of insulation, but it's not fire resistant. Now, the fascinating thing here is if you've got the technology, you can hit those aluminum plates with an electromagnetic pulse and get a spark across them. So literally, you could write your flame or your flame pattern. You could mount a laser or some device that bombards the exterior of the building with an electromagnetic pulse.
Even a microwave weapon of some kind.
Microwave weapon, exactly, because sometimes if I put my food in the microwave and leave some, I don't know, aluminium foil or something, you get sparks. It's very impressive. Correct. Right? Well, those sparks would be hot enough to ignite the polyethylene or rocket fuel, if it's rocket fuel. Now, rocket fuel is essentially, it would be looking like a viscoplastic polymer, right, where there's a lot of aluminum powder and an oxygen bringer, silicon dioxide or whatever it is, ammonium perchlorate, which brings the oxygen to the fuel, and then you get a very satisfactory temperature of 5,800 degrees Fahrenheit, which is twice the boiling point or melting point of steel, which would give you exactly what you saw in the Twin Towers.
What you're describing, David, makes me think that this may have been the ignition mechanism for this nanothermite compound. So again, in these sort of complex scenarios, trying to unravel what is going on, perhaps, the thermite is painted there, and then something along the lines of what you're describing is used to ignite it. A microwave weapon, of course, could be projected from within the building or elsewhere. But Wikipedia is telling us that thermite is a pyrotechnic composition of metal powder which serves as fuel and metal oxide. My understanding is that it's used for things like underwater welding in oxygen poor environments because the compound contains oxygen within it.
Correct. It's also used in fireworks. Right? Essentially, the fuel is the aluminum powder.
Right.
Now, Ramzi Yousef used 100 pounds of aluminum powder in his 1993 bomb. Right? It was quite a sophisticated bomb. And as I say, he said, well, give me more money next time and I'll bring them down, which of course he did. The interesting thing is what happened. Well, no, correction. Who had custody of the Ramzi Yousef SWAT team on 911? Well, Christine Marcy did. Because
why is that?
Well, she took him and put him in ADX Florence, the Supermax jail, right? Side by side with Ted Kaczynski and Timothy McVeigh.
Wow.
So this woman is basically set up a little university of, if you will, of bomb building experts.
So this is in Colorado, ADX Florence?
ADX Florence. Is that Colorado? I guess it is, isn't it? Or Arizona?
I think it's, well, according to what I've got here, Federal Correctional Institute. It looks like it's in Colorado. Sorry, David, we've lost your camera. Can you tilt down a bit?
Oh, sorry, I was just getting back. Yeah, okay.
So I think we're looking at the Federal Correctional Complex here. It doesn't look like we have 3D data on it in Google Earth, but yeah, this is USP Florence, the United States Penitentiary. Way out there in Colorado.
Yeah, so there we are. So there we have the ingredients of a Con Air SWAT team, which, provided it had access to these various exotic patented devices, including the one I described, which could serve as an insulator or as an incendiary. Now, just to make clear, you detonate explosives and you ignite incendiaries, right?
Okay.
So the mechanism of detonation and the devices associated with detonation are different from the explosive themselves. And each of those kind of things are the subject very often of a whole different family of patents. The fascinating thing about patents is all of the really exciting technologies in World War II, and I'm not being jingoistic I believe, or I hope, were invented by the British, because the Brits had their back to the wall in World War II. They were being attacked by the Germans. Their production facilities were getting hammered left, right, and center. But the Brits are very inventive, and in fact, they've transferred a lot of that inventiveness to America. But the Brits didn't appear to relinquish control of the patent office, right?
Yes.
Ever. Like right back to 1811, but we can come to that in a minute. Anyway, a man called Henry Tizard and his son Andrew Tizard, who was a friend of mine when I was working in artificial intelligence in the UK, was sent by Churchill and Victor Rothschild, it would appear, to Washington with all of the top secret British inventions, because what the British had were the inventions and in some cases the patents. I'll come to that in a minute. But they didn't have the production capability because they were having the shit, excuse the vulgarity, bombed out of them by the Germans. Right? So they needed American production. And the Americans, in order to produce, would have needed the technology to make these major advances that were essential to the success, if you will, of the Allies in World War II. And I'm talking about the cavity magnetron. But I'll come back to that later, because I think I'd just stay with
That's
Con Air.
very interesting, though, cavity magnetron. That's some sort of microwave weapon, right?
Yeah, exactly, because up to then, the radar systems didn't have much resolution, and one thing they couldn't see from a mile out from a plane was the periscope of a German submarine popping up at night for refueling or whatever it is they did at night. So the Brits had invented this cavity magnetron, and Victor Rothschild, who was the sort of the right-hand man for Churchill for all these gadgets, you know, that were incorporated under the Churchill's toy ship, so-called.
Right.
He was visiting the Birmingham University where the cavity magnetron had been invented and developed, and he nicked or stole one of the cavity magnetrons, and he went away, and 3 days later he sent a message back to the professor who had invented it and said, "You've got to be more careful with your security." This was 1939 or 1940. So now the interesting question is, did Victor Rothschild take copies of the drawings of the cavity magnetron and share them with the Germans, the Russians, or the Imperial Japanese Navy? I think it's a very interesting line of thought that he actually sent a copy or the details of the cavity magnetron to the Imperial Japanese Navy through a Scottish traitor named Lord Arthur Sempill, Semphil. And Lord Arthur Sempill was a World War I fighter pilot, ace, and he'd gone to Japan, and as fast as this little scumbag was doing, he was transferring the Royal Navy's secrets to the Imperial Japanese Navy. So why wouldn't he have transferred the cavity magnetron to the Imperial Japanese Navy so they could steer their planes to Pearl Harbor? So that, I think, is an interesting theory to be explored. Yeah, there's the man up on your website. So he was recognized as a traitor in the UK, but because he had connections with the royal family, he was left to do his worst. And I would say that this man is responsible for leaking details of the cavity magnetron and a few other technologies to the Japanese that made the attack on Pearl Harbor so successful from their point of view.
Wow.
And successful from Churchill's point of view, because that brought the Americans into the war.
But David, I notice he has Forbes in his name.
Yes?
That's a famous name I've heard before.
Yes, I don't know whether there's a connection to the Forbes, business magazine and so on. Anyway, hopping back to Con Air, so we know that on 911, and the first Con Air plane was bought by Christine Marcy when she was senior counsel for the United States Marshal Service and the Immigration and Naturalization Systems Deportation and Detention Program. Enormously influential woman. We should never underestimate this. I think she's a psychopath. I also think she's keeping Field's wife out of the country, but that's, for another subject. So back in 1995, Christine Marcy, who had founded the Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Fund in 1985 or 1984, and the database for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in 1984. So when you think of this woman, she's got a reservoir of children who can be used for the purposes of entrapment and blackmail.
Right.
She's got access to huge amounts of money because, God forbid, you're driving down in New York with your Lamborghini, Jason, and they look at your cash flow or whatever it is, and they say, if Jason's got a Lamborghini, we're going to confiscate it because we think it must be based on the proceeds of crime, right? And then you have to sue these guys to get it back. Well, what are you going to do if it was based on organized crime? You're going to let them keep it, right?
Right.
Or you're going to say to the sheriff who confiscated it, look, I've got a truck with 2 tons of cocaine coming behind this Lamborghini. You take the Lamborghini and you let my truck go through to New York, and I can peddle it to Trump's friends in the mafia.
Or
right?
just buy another Lamborghini once the sale goes through.
Exactly. So this Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Fund, set up by Christine Marcy, for heaven's sake, in 1984, gave her the money, the children for entrapment purposes, and the Con Air plane of, I think it was a Boeing 727 of 1985, with which she could fly Con Air SWAT teams anywhere in the United States to do a hit and have them back in jail for dinner or breakfast with a nearly perfect alibi.
And I always find it interesting when we see these Hollywood movies that sort of mimic this stuff, like this one we were talking about with the Suicide Squad, because it's somehow, I think they're trying to like mentally let people, so when you hear about it, it's not so shocking. You're like, oh, that's just like Suicide Squad or the movie Con Air.
Exactly. You see, so I think, was it Edelman or the Eichmann or whatever it was, he said, let's give them a limited hangout. Right. So you put it into Hollywood, right? And then when the facts that actually represent what was shown on the film appear in reality, the public is told, oh, it's just a film. I mean, it's just someone script writing. So the conspiracy theorists are dismissed as sort of wannabe script writers.
Right. You got that idea from the movie or whatever.
Exactly. So it takes you away from coming back to the actus reus at the crime scene. And in that post, the one that you got yesterday or today, this morning,
yes.
What we're talking about is the possibility of a class action suit, right, crowdfunded with a docudrama that would explain to, and I think I'm quite proud of this term, the injured community, right? So let's say, for example, on 911, there were several injured communities, and my understanding, and I'm not a lawyer, of a class action suit, you can only make members of the class those who have shared in some significant sense the consequences of a given crime.
Injured parties.
Yeah. So, for example, and this is where Field McConnell comes in, I would see that Field's knowledge would be superb at unraveling the facts of the case for the passengers and the pilot and the crew of flight, is it American 11 that allegedly hit the north face of the Pentagon? Sorry, not the Pentagon, the north face of the North Tower?
I believe so, yes. 77 was what they attribute to the Pentagon.
Yes. So, but that class action suit for those people in that injured community or their relatives would be different from a class action suit for the people in the fire department of New York who were killed in the collapse of the North and the South Tower.
Right.
So my sense is there is an opportunity for a class action suit and a docudrama that focuses on the facts of the case that brought down the North Tower. Now, whether the fire department of New York would be interested, I don't know, but you're showing at the moment that extraordinary video of two tough-looking characters. One's got powder all over his face and a bleeding nose, and he's desperately trying to communicate with his sister. There's a white guy, and beside him is a black guy who puts his arm on the guy's shoulder. And these two guys, I think, are just, they're perfect sparks or characters for a docudrama because they intimately experience the facts of the crime. They would be expert witnesses.
And they're probably quite sick now because they've been exposed to crazy chemicals. They're probably quite sick.
And I hope they're as mad as hell, right? Yeah. Now, one of the interesting things about people who are as mad as hell who don't speak up is, and I use the analogy, let's say that Donald Trump on 9/1 was told, hey, Donald, we got some planes heading your way, and we're trying to work out whether to take out the North Tower and Trump Tower. Now, Donald Trump might say, well, I don't believe you can do that to whoever is at the other end of the communications device, and they divert from the Trump Tower to the South Tower. Now, is it feasible? Well, of course it is. If they can bring down the North Tower and the South Tower on 9/11, they could have brought down the Trump Tower, right?
Yes.
Now, I'm not saying it was a target, but let's say Donald Trump would be foolhardy to believe that whoever put on the 9/11 attack couldn't, at any time of their choosing, take out the Trump Tower.
Right.
And a few weeks ago, I believe the fire did break out at the Trump Tower, right?
There was, yeah.
Now, and that looks to me like an accelerant was used to start that fire in one of the rooms or offices or homes. And I think someone was killed in the Trump Tower in that particular incident.
I think one person, right.
But now, what we're really saying is there are a number of reasons why those firefighters who survived, and there are names actually given by those individuals in that interview on that clip you just had.
Yeah.
So we know who they are. I assume they're still alive. They may be very sick because of what they ingested or breathed in on 9/11. But anyway, there are two individuals. that I would like to think are as mad as hell and they're not going to take it anymore. Now,
Right.
what did these guys do, or what was done to them to get them to keep their mouths shut? Because they heard, and they said they heard, explosives. Well, one way of doing it is for the insurance company to pop its ugly little head up, and actually that would be AXA Equitable Life, which had a headquarters office in New York. And what AXA Equitable Life said is, after 9/11, we've opened an office to expedite payments, because you see a lot of bodies were missing. So the families of those people who died, in many cases, those firefighters who died were breadwinners for the family. You know, there was
Right.
no other source of income.
Yeah.
So many of those families were actually not destitute, but couldn't pay the rent and couldn't carry on. They were desperate for money. The AXA Equitable Life pop up and say, okay, we will accelerate the compensation to you. You come to us with proof of that your firefighter relative didn't come home on 9/11, and we can arrange it with the legal system that he's presumed to have been dead, or she. I don't know how many women were killed in that incident. And we will settle $2 million with you, the family, on the condition that you don't come back to us at some later date and ask for more money. Right? So there's a deal done with the insurance company to keep the witnesses or the relatives of the witnesses' mouths shut, so a class action suit doesn't pop up and say, well, we want $100 million or $1 billion, because there was fraud and criminality behind this.
Well, David, look at what's just occurred only 3 weeks ago. AXA Equitable has raised $2.75 billion in what is the biggest initial public offering in the United States so far in 2018.
Well, and these were the people who accelerated the payments. So there's two reasons, or there may be many others that I don't know about, why the relatives of a member of the fire department of New York would not want to issue or launch or help launch a class action suit. One is they're being paid off to keep their mouths shut. And secondly, they're scared to death.
Right.
Because their relatives were murdered on 9/11. This wasn't an accident where they happened to be inside the building that fell on them, because the radios, the Motorola radios that they were using, had been hacked.
How do we know that?
Because they didn't get the order to evacuate.
Due to
Right?
hacking?
None of them. They were hacked, right? And the Motorola radios that they had used through the 1993 attack had been taken out of commission, I think around March of 2001, and replaced with a later model Motorola system that lasted about a week, when they found it wasn't good enough to get to the firefighters who'd been trapped in a building. So for a week, all of the Fire Department of New York radios, Motorola radios, were taken out of commission, giving an opportunity to modify them for jamming purposes. Then they were returned to them.
Wow.
All right. So I looked now in the patents available to Motorola, and it turns out there's a number of patents that relate to encryption,
Yeah.
right, that would allow a number of the insiders of the Fire Department of New York to be issued with radios that would work, whereas the grunts, the guys who went up into the building, were issued with radios that could be jammed.
Wow.
Now, you talked earlier about igniting these incendiaries. Well, those Motorola radios that were used, and I believe issued to certain insiders of the Fire Department of New York, could have been hooked up to igniters in the elevator shafts.
But David, it's so hard to believe that members of the New York City Fire Department would knowingly allow, they actually refer to each other as brothers when they're in the fire department.
Of course they do, but there's another option. They may knowingly or unknowingly have allowed their Motorola radios to be modified such that an injection of an ignition signal could come through the Motorola radio, right, used by, for example, the fire chief who was killed outside the North Tower, having survived the collapse of the South Tower. And my prediction is that we will find his radio system was used to relay an ignition signal into the North Tower and bring it down and kill him.
Wow.
Right? So you don't need, in many ways with this technology, it's smarter to issue something or some technology to a patsy, if you will, and not tell them that their modified piece of equipment can be used to relay or jam the signals or communication system used by their colleagues, like the guys who went into the building and didn't get the message to evacuate. There we are. So Fire Department of New York fire chief killed on 911 gets proper burial 15 years later. All right? Now, I don't think that's the name that I thought it was. I thought it was a name called Garci. Let me just check.
Now, David, I don't know if you're aware of this, but the very controversial sheriff of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, Joe Lombardo, has recently implemented an encrypted Motorola radio system for the Las Vegas Metro PD, and many people, including Laura Loomer and myself, have speculated that he's doing that so that people can't receive the police scanner recordings in the way that they did after the October 1st shooting.
Well, this is very interesting because when we stray into encryption, for example, Boeing has an asymmetric encryption routing system where you can take a satellite and communicate with any number of planes with encryption at two levels. One is what they call the header information that allows you to send the more deeply encrypted signal and bounce it around various planes to a target, and then allow certain people inside the most secure plane to read what the message is.
Wow.
And so you've created actually a two-tier encryption system at Boeing, and that's another SWAT team that I can come to, which is consistent with what was happening on 911, because it seems like a group of planes were taken off their regular en route airway and sent towards a certain destination, but a deeper group of encryption was actually hooked through to the plane's precision guidance system. So when it got near its target, for example, the Pentagon or the North Tower, it switched on to a gyroscope mode, like a missile, and was flown into the target.
Wow. And the priority date on this patent is May 4th, 2001.
You got it. Right, so now here was what was happening. Let me just go back to that Con Air patent, which is so critical. The man who patented it, and it's jaw-dropping, is a man called Jerome Lemelson. And Jerome Lemelson is one of the most productive inventors, but I believe he's what's known as an NPE in patent law, which means a non-producing entity or non-production entity.
Quite so what a lot he was of doing, returns when searching for his name.
Well, there should be, because from the 1950s, 60s, and I think he died maybe just before 911, so his inventions went through to his estate and his widow. He was trawling around the technical magazines and trying to understand what big companies like Sony were working on. Mm-hmm. And then he would go to the patent office, look at the state of the art as defined at the patent office, and he'd try and write a patent that would anticipate what would come out of the Sony research laboratories maybe 5 or 10 years further down the road. When Sony produces its stuff, he would sue them for violating his patent.
He went to NYU, just like me.
Right? And then, effectively, Sony would pay him protection money. Right?
This says he died October 1st, 1997, at the age of 74. Okay. Not that old.
Not that old, but with 605 patents to his credit, never having produced any one of them.
Wow.
In the old days, you used to have to produce a model.
Yeah, he's like the ultimate patent troll.
Exactly. So when I invented my deductive computing machine and object-oriented fractal paintbrush back in the 1980s, I had actually built a system using those techniques for Britoil in Glasgow. It was runner-up for the British Computer Society Gold Medal Award, and basically it's a technology that allows you to simulate real or unreal events. I look back at that, and I look at the plane ghosting through the North Tower, and the other plane coming through the South Tower with a missile coming out the other side of the South Tower, and I'm saying, hell's bells, these people have copied, knowingly or unknowingly, my patent. Right? So they're actually doing what I can do, and that's what we would do with these docudramas. I can show anyone who's really good with programming or developing special effects in the film industry, how to simulate a real world event and constrain that simulation so it obeys the same laws of physics as the real world is obliged to. And let me give you two examples of the real laws of physics applying on 9/11 and with the assassination of JFK. You and I know, and you've studied this, James E. Files claims to have shot a Kennedy with a Remington XP-100, a Redfield scope,
yes,
and a mercury-filled bullet.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes,
now,
and it was a hollow point bullet, so it does not have the characteristics of a full metal jacketed bullet, which I heard a conversation you were having with Field. Of course, a full metal jacket would be a through and through, and the hollow point, coupled with the mercury tip, would create a massive hydrostatic shock wave that would explode the back of Kennedy's head.
You've got it. So when one of the doctors, whose names I forget, was looking at the corpse of JFK and looking down on his head, I don't know if he used exactly those words. He said, I don't see an exit hole. Now, you didn't see an exit hole because there wasn't one. I mean, that's my belief. I think Kennedy was shot by a modified dum-dum bullet or a hollow point bullet with mercury in it, and it blew the back of his head off.
Well, right. Many of them, as I recall, there was Dr. McClellan, and he's one of the most known, Dr. McClellan. But they all described a fist-size defect at the back of Kennedy's head, which, when you see the autopsy photos, show nothing like that.
Yeah, because that's what the so-called Harper fragment on the grass in Dealey Plaza was picked up by Billy Harper and presumably found its way back to wherever Kennedy's body was. Whether they put that fragment back and tested it to fit, obviously it was from his skull, or whether the X-rays just don't show the gaping hole because they've covered it with something X-ray. What I'm getting at is there's no small exit hole consistent with a full metal jacket bullet or full jacket metal bullet, right?
Right. Which is, incidentally, that's what the sixth floor shooter was shooting, and that would explain why it would go through Kennedy's neck into Connolly and all that. That is the expected behavior of a full metal jacket bullet. Correct.
Now, the dum-dum bullet was patented in 1890 by the Brits, and it's kind of sick. Whether it's amusing, I don't know. It depends on your sense of humor. Sometimes I think Blackadder should do a show on this. But anyway, the British said, when we're administering our colonial empire, occasionally our troops are attacked by fanatical tribesmen. And they can take up to 6 full metal jacket bullets and still get through to our people and cut their heads off. So we have to stop them in their tracks. Right. So they invented the dum-dum bullet. And I think by the end of the 19th century, the British had a stock of 60 million dum-dum bullets, right?
And a dum-dum bullet is just a hollow point, right?
Yeah, with a crosshatch at the top. So it opens up as it enters the body. And it transfers most of its kinetic energy into the onrushing target. The argument being, well, if 6 full jacket bullets doesn't stop a fanatical tribesman, maybe we'll hit them with these dum-dum bullets that slow them down a bit, right?
Right.
So that was introduced, and there were 2 countries that didn't sign on to the Hague Convention of 1899, I think, against the use of these things. One was South Africa, and one was the United Kingdom. Right? The question we have to ask ourselves is, since this was a British patent about the time of the 1890s, what happens to these patents using the theory that we're developing, that they're putting together a family of patented SWAT teams that can use these kinds of technologies to attack a major target? Well, I think we can prove that the hollow point bullet or dum-dum bullet has been refined consistently since 1890 and is now actually available to the tune of 1.4 billion rounds of hollow point ammunition in the custody of the Department of Homeland Security.
Right.
And my question is, If you go to the technology patented by a guy called, I think is Darrell Rubin's biological bullet. Do you have that on your system? And this is so incredible, right? The Darrell Rubin biological active bullet. There we are, systems and methods. And you read this, it's the most cold, cynical description of horror that you could ever imagine. That is to say, you can put in the hollow space of these bullets, you can put anthrax, ricin, hallucinogens, anticoagulants, nerve agents, etc., to cause an effect over and above the kinetic transfer of energy into the body of the victim.
David, sorry to interrupt, something interesting came up when I was looking into something else. They were talking about the experimentation and the use of microwave electromagnetic weapons, and talking about how the dissemination of relatively innocuous chemical compounds that are then ingested by large numbers of people just through breathing or drinking the water or whatever, and then hitting those people who had been exposed to those chemicals with microwaves or other forms of electromagnetic radiation, activated those chemicals in such a way that it was like killing massive numbers of people and leaving like zero footprint as to how it was done.
Yeah, well, I don't know about that, but again, using the techniques that we've developed now, if that proves to be a possibility, I would certainly look into the patent office, right, to see if there's anything whose footprint or signature parallels what you just described, right? But we don't have to look particularly far. For example, if we're looking for an explanation of that attack on the Skripals, the father and the daughter in Salisbury in Wiltshire, because did you know they've recovered?
Yeah, I heard that.
It's supposed to be one of the most toxic chemical substances ever, and only takes a little drop and you're dead.
Yeah.
Now, what could have happened is, first of all, Novichok is stocked in the United States, including at Northwestern University.
Right, Bernardine Dawn. How do you like this headline, David?
What?
When the New York Times is saying that Skripal attacks scared UK doctors, we were expecting them not to survive.
Right, of course they were. Right, but you see, if you've got there was a guy I think called Markov in London who was shot with a ricin pellet fired from an umbrella, very famous case.
Right.
Well, effectively, that's a dum-dum bullet. All right.
A biological bullet or a dum-dum bullet?
It's a biological bullet. I mean, it's some pill that's fired into the body, it penetrates the body, and releases ricin, which is a highly toxic substance, and kills the guy. Right. So, for all I know, they could have fired a pellet into the bodies of Skripal and his daughter, Julia, all right, on the park bench. It would be instant acting, but by calibrating the amount of the toxin or poison, they could produce any effect, ranging from death right through to some kind of toxic shock to which they're expected to recover. And that would be consistent with the mailing, for example, of an envelope containing a material to the Marine Corps headquarters that caused 11 nosebleeds. Right? Now, so they've looked at the substance and they can't find anything, and the world and the media has moved on. But just think if the message being sent to the Marines was, well, next time we're going to have anthrax mixed with this powder, and you're not going to recover.
Right. And so, obviously, David, the use of these types of clandestine weapons, this Wikipedia article is talking about how Georgy Markov was assassinated on a London street via a micro-engineered pellet containing ricin fired into his leg from an umbrella wielded by someone associated with the Bulgarian Secret Service, and it has been speculated that they asked the KGB for help. So these type of clandestine weapons that sort of leave zero footprint as to, it's not like a bullet that can be traced to a gun with the rifling pattern and all that, right? Well,
exactly, and they say it's the Bulgarian Secret Service. I would say 10 times more likely it's the British Secret Service.
Wow.
right?
Or
Because
certainly they're assisting them if they're operating within London or aware of their activities, right?
and it's the intent is to create a crime scene where you can attribute the guilt to some amorphous organization that's out there that doesn't even bother to defend itself,
Right.
that deflects your attention from the British Secret Service, which has been doing these things for far longer than the Bulgarian
Right.
Secret Service, right? Going back to, well, 1890 and maybe before. So then I just want to talk about a little more about exit and entrance holes. So in the case
Sure.
of JFK, we have a small entrance hole just above his right temple,
Yes.
which I understand is consistent with what James E. Files said he did,
Yep.
and a large exit hole which has blown a 6 square inch fragment out of the back of his head. And there's no sign of a normal exit hole consistent with a full metal jacket bullet, right?
Now, let me pause you for a second, David, because what I'm showing right now is one of the officially released autopsy photos, and I'm not on screen now, but I am making air quotes as I say photos, because to the viewers watching right now, it may not be immediately obvious, but that autopsy photo, which disappeared when I clicked on it, is actually a charcoal drawing. These things that for many years were presented as photos are drawings. This is a charcoal drawing, not an actual photograph. And of course, Robert Groden, who has appeared in the past on Crowdsource the Truth, many years later revealed an alternate set of autopsy photos that to this day he will not tell me how he obtained these photos, but they are much more revealing of the extensive damage to the back of the president's head. The other thing that's very interesting about this, David, is that these photographs were taken by a police photographer who had a very systematic method of taking the pictures. And the subsequent photos, there are 2 photos that match the one that we're looking at right now, and they are taken at a slight vertical offset to one another. And an interesting technique that I have come to understand through my work in stereoscopic filmmaking is that anytime you have that type of offset, what you can do, since this is a vertical offset, you can rotate the images 90 degrees so that that vertical offset now is essentially a horizontal offset, and the 2 images can become left and right images in a stereoscopic pair. And when this image is viewed stereoscopically, this right now in 2-dimensional form, this just looks like a sloppy mess of hair. But when viewed stereoscopically, what we are looking at is a gigantic conical hole in the back of the president's head with brain matter just dripping out.
Consistent with a mercury-filled bullet.
Certainly consistent with a, not with a full metal jacket bullet, either mercury tipped or certainly a frangible round or hollow point round that expands once it enters. But when you watch the Zapruder film, irrespective of anything else that might be going on in terms of editing or what, there is a massive explosion around Kennedy's head when that shot hits.
And it jerks backwards.
It does.
So for momentum, conservation of linear momentum and energy, is the kinetics are going through his, just above his right eye, and blasting out the back, and his head moves backwards. His head wouldn't move backwards if it was hit from behind, it'd move forward.
I agree completely, although there's been extensive efforts to convince people that it could do that if shot from behind.
And that's consistent with the constant effort to try and violate the laws of physics, which is very difficult for these people. You can do it through the media, and you can, that paraphrase, you can fool some of the people all the time and all the people some of the time. I also use the phrase, I paraphrase that, you can frighten some of the people all of the time, and you can frighten all of the people some of the time, but you can't frighten all of the people all of the time. And my prayer is that there are people in the fire department of New York, coming back to my maybe wishful thinking, who can understand that if they don't do anything, this pattern of criminality is going to repeat and repeat until one day, instead of using high explosives in a penetrator missile, they'll use radioactive and nuclear system and blow the hell out of New York, right? So we have to move collectively, the world, we the people. We have to get into this crime scene and start understanding the facts of the case, the actus reus, without reference to the mens rea. It's so seductive to say, oh, well, why did Bush do it? Or why didn't he do it? Or is it the Jesuits? Or is it the Pope? Or is it the Queen of England, et cetera, et cetera? All of that is very
Mossad.
tempting.
Everybody likes to blame Mossad.
Oh, yes, exactly. Right. Without saying, well, let's go through the crime scene and find out the facts. And I think Sherlock Holmes said, when you've dismissed the impossible, the improbable, no matter how unlikely, is true.
Yes.
So in the case of JFK, we have a small entrance hole and a huge exit hole, right? Now, in the case of the attack on the Pentagon, it's very interesting because the exit hole is smaller than the entrance. Because if you follow the path of whatever it was that hit the Pentagon, and it certainly wasn't a Boeing 727 or 757 or whatever it was, at the inner courtyard there is a 12-foot or 14-foot diameter circular hole with about 1.5 tons of debris that's gone through to the inner courtyard. If you look at the outside of the Pentagon, you see it's a bit analogous to Kennedy's skull fragment. There's a huge frontal area of Wedge 1 of the Pentagon that has collapsed. So it's not obvious which part of it was hit by the plane, but the extent, the horizontal and vertical extent of the damage is consistent with, if you were using your Hollywood techniques, of creating an impression that it was hit by a plane.
Right.
But that's not consistent with the hole in the inner courtyard. Right?
It's very suspicious, that situation at the Pentagon.
Yeah, so what happens is, then I Google for words like penetrator, Lockheed Martin, and if you Google for, I think it's a rocket-accelerated penetrator, hardened penetrator, Lockheed Martin patent, you'll find there's a patent there, or patented device that fits perfectly the characteristics of the attack on the north and the south face of the towers, where as you look at on the second video, I think that was taken by the other Node brothers, of the plane going into the south face of the South Tower, it kind of ghosts in, and then around the back someone's got a photograph of what comes out the other side, and it's a missile.
Wow.
It's a penetrator, right? So what they've done is some sophisticated bit of graphics or video graphics. They've created the impression of a plane hitting the south face of the South Tower, but it masks, or is intended to mask, the actual attack on the south face of the South Tower with one of these Lockheed Martin devices.
Wow, David. I mean, we're in disagreement on that. I feel pretty strongly that an airplane hit the South Tower of the Pentagon. How would we have immediately had so many angles of video of plane hitting that building?
I'm not saying that a plane didn't hit the south face of the South Tower. However, the penetrator device was carried in whatever it was that hit the south face of the South Tower, because only the penetrator device could have gone right through.
I see. Hard target penetrator with multi-segmenting casing cutter is definitely a patent there. David, it's amazing the conversations that we get into. Some people on Periscope are complaining that we can't stick to a topic, but I like the sort of non sequitur nature. It's almost like a jazz session when we start talking.
Right.
I do want to take you back to one topic, though. Can I?
Yes, okay.
So you spoke about the magnetron, and this is amazingly coincidental that you would bring this up in our conversation today. I've mentioned to you in the past my associate Quinn Michaels, and in about December, Quinn suffered a spontaneous collapse of his lung, which is not entirely uncommon for heavy smokers, which Quinn definitely was. But we speculated at the time that it could have been caused by a microwave weapon, and that had a microwave weapon been fired at Quinn Michaels, it could have aggravated a weak spot in his lung and caused it to pop. Now, we also have in our possession a piece of evidence that indicates an individual was tracking this person. He said in a text message that he knew the location of Quinn Michaels, a location that Quinn had not shared with anyone. He just got off the highway after a long day of driving, hadn't even reserved a room, just went to the first hotel, motel that he found, stayed there, and that night had this collapsed lung. Earlier in the day, on his own live streaming videos, he observed a very new-looking Mercedes van with Texas license plates that seemed to be following him in New Mexico. So, in addition to my own speculative process of thinking, hey, this microwave oven can generate a lot of heat, and certainly if you put a chicken in there for a minute or 2 or 5, it'll explode the chicken. What if someone could somehow jerry-rig a weapon from the materials in a microwave oven? And sure enough, I did find some scientifically oriented YouTube videos that do exactly that. Take apart a microwave oven and construct a very dangerous microwave weapon. What do you think about the realistic possibility that someone could have used this type of weapon against another person?
Absolutely, and for example, the cavity magnetron is that. It's an electromagnetic pulse device,
right,
that can pick up. But it's certainly feasible, but I do want to pay attention to the people who are complaining about the way we're hopping around the subjects and come back to the discipline of the four horsemen, right?
Yes.
Now, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, it's a powerful phrase, and there's some wonderful graphics that I've been using in my posts. Mm-hmm. But I'm trying to relate this to the Serco attack on New York on 9/11 and the attack on the Pentagon on 9/11. Yes. So Serco has custody, effectively, of 4 different families of SWAT teams. Serco is a leading supplier of transportation services to the United Kingdom for the movement of prisoners around.
Yes.
In the United Kingdom and in Australia and New Zealand. And that parallels the service developed by Phil McConnell's sister, Christine Marcy, that is known as Con Air or JPATS. Right. So between Serco and Christine Marcy, who I believe is the head of the Con Air SWAT team family used on 911,
right.
They are moving tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of exceedingly dangerous people, plus a few patses, around the world. And one of the things that Christine Marcy developed is a prisoner medical services program.
Right.
Now, you just imagine you're in a jail, maybe on a relatively minor offense, and someone like Marcy controls who your cellmates are going to be. Mm-hmm. Now, if you got 5 years in jail, the people you share your cell with are going to have a big influence on your life.
Or death.
You got it. Now, what happens if you're accused in the jail system of being a pedophile?
Killed, I would think.
They'll kill you, right? So they've got to be isolated. So the degree of control of someone like Marcy over the occupants in a jail system is huge. She can drug them, she can have them killed, she can fly them from one jail to another, she can even have them let out on parole. So for me, the Con Air SWAT team is the most powerful global force for organized crime. It can be pointed into a crime scene that is remote. It could be the bombing of the London Underground, the attack in Belgium, that just happened, the attack in the climate change conference in Paris, when they shot up that concert hall, etc.
Yeah.
These people can be flown in, do the hit. Some of them are killed, like the Dirty Dozen, but it doesn't matter, they're expendable, or brought back to jail if they're really useful, like the 3 cellmates, or, in the ADX jail, you have Timothy McVeigh, and you have Ramzi Youssef, and you have Ted Kaczynski. That's a pretty good team, isn't it?
Yeah.
To have in storage, to make a bomb, or design a 911 attack. They've got all the expertise you want. So the next family of SWAT teams that I believe are germane to the attack on 911, I call it the Lutnick SWAT team. Now, Howard Lutnick is a very interesting guy.
Oh, yeah.
Because if you look for Howard Lutnick, he's almost as prolific an inventor as Jerome Lemelson.
Right.
So Lutnick is spelled Lutnick. Does that ring a bell, that name?
I think you've mentioned him to me before, but he's related to the guy who was the head of Cantor Fitzgerald or something. Oh no, he is
the guy.
CEO. Right.
Now, on 911, he decided that he was going to take his child to school.
Right.
Instead of coming to the office, leaving his brother and 657 of his colleagues,
including friends of mine,
including friends of yours, to be fried.
Yeah.
Not one of them survived that attack.
Yep.
And there was a guy called Carlton Bartels who had invented a CO2e.com trading system, right? Which was a patent that would offer enormous amounts of money if the world could be deluded into believing that carbon dioxide is a pollutant and a cause of catastrophic anthropogenic global warming. It's bullshit, of course, because carbon dioxide is a trace gas, it's odorless, it's wholly beneficial, and it actually acts as a fertilizer that helps the plants go green. So if these clowns really wanted to ban carbon dioxide, the plants would go brown because they'd die, and they should change their name from the Green Party to the Brown Party. But that doesn't have the same cachet, right?
Right.
So just a simple analysis of the facts of the case show you that there's something profoundly suspicious about Howard Lutnick's movements on 911.
Wow.
And then I discovered relatively recently that he'd invented, maybe 4 or 5 or 6 months ago, that he'd invented an interactive gaming system online for event outcomes.
Right. Death pool betting.
Well, exactly. So why wouldn't you set up an opportunity, a junket room, I believe they're called, on the 47th floor of the North Tower for junket room betting on the number of the body counts for each of these attacks?
Yeah.
Now that meeting of Serco shareholders on the 47th floor of the morning of 911 was hosted, I believe, by their investment banker. Their investment banker is N.M. Rothschild and Sons Limited.
Wow.
So for all I know, the guy who put on that shareholders meeting on the 47th floor of the North Tower on the morning of 911 was Wilbur Ross.
Who's
Wilbur
now
Ross,
Trump's
Commerce Secretary.
Wow.
So now, what does Wilbur Ross know about the investment strategy for Queen Elizabeth II and Donald Trump and Serco? Well, quite a lot, presumably, because N.M. Rothschild is the investment banker for Queen Elizabeth II, Donald Trump, and Serco.
Wow.
And back in 1811, go ahead.
So you don't have confidence that Donald Trump is draining the swamp?
Let's say my prayer is that Donald Trump is going to choose between death or glory. Right? It's very obvious that they could have taken out Trump Tower on 911, but they chose not to. It's very obvious that from the earliest days of his career as a real estate developer, he would have been a target for the mob in New Jersey and New York. It's very obvious that when Citigroup or Citibank lent him $380 million to buy Trump shuttle Boeings, and he was flying high rollers around in planes, I shake my head, the toilet seats were gold plated.
Yeah, I've been on that airline. It existed for a very short time.
Did you use the gold-plated toilet seat?
I remember seeing it.
Did it feel different?
I don't think it was real gold, or at least that was my impression that it wasn't. But the seats were nicer, the aircraft was nicer, and I think it came in just before. It was like 1999, maybe that was around. I don't remember when Trump Airlines was around, but it was short-lived because people were getting more interested in value and less interested in luxury for flying.
Right. Now, going on to Lutnick, so for your listeners who feel we jump around a bit, my claim is that there are 4 horsemen of the apocalypse that are loosely described as the 4 families of SWAT teams that had to be deployed in a coordinated and synchronized way to pull off the attempted overthrow of the United States government on the morning of 9/11. And for example, had that 4th plane hit the Capitol building, which was the intent, except it was left 41 minutes late, then you and I would not be having this conversation today.
Why? What would have happened?
there would have been an overthrow of the government of the United States, and it would have the vacuum. Let's say if you hit the Capitol building and killed 535 congressmen and senators, what happens to your succession principle?
Yeah, out the window.
They're dead, right? You've got a vacuum at the top, which is now filled by a paramilitary group that is infested the Navy, the Air Force, the Army, and the Marine Corps. And let's not pretend that the Marine Corps is a bunch of innocents. Lee Harvey Oswald was a Marine, right?
Yes.
Well, there you go. And this guy, Oliver Buck Revell, he was a Marine, a helicopter pilot in Vietnam.
Right.
And he was the guy who took his son and daughter-in-law off the tarmac when Pan Am 103 took off to be blown up over Lockerbie.
Robert David Steele was
Oliver
a
Buck
Marine as
Revell,
well.
Yeah, and Oliver Buck Revell is dirty because in 1999 he set up an organization in Vancouver, near where I am, called Imagis Technologies, IMAGIS Technologies, that in the United Kingdom is working with the National Crime Squad and Serco on face recognition of pedophiles and criminals.
But what about this? It says he's the executive vice president of Rogue DNA in Vancouver.
Right. Well, I think his operation has changed names quite a lot. It's a basic technique, right? But he was also the FBI director for counterintelligence and counterterrorism for a number of years. He's at the grade of SES 6 and allegedly was promoted to the senior executive service in 1978, which is, I think, the year before it was officially launched under Jimmy Carter by Christine Marcy as a charter member. And I think there was a guy who was giving you a lot of harassment about whether or not Christine Marcy founded the SES or not. I don't care whether
he disappeared.
Yes, he did. Well, I imagine that he was trying to defend the indefensible, because whether she's technically the founder, she's certainly a charter member.
Right.
And there were only 7 of these clowns, right? And they created, in my opinion, a paramilitary bureaucracy that has control over the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, if you will. So we've covered 2. We've got Christine Marcy as the titular head, if that's the right word, of the Con Air SWAT team, which is one of the horses of 911. We've got Howard Lutnick, who's invented a number of gaming technologies, including wireless gaming technologies, which would have allowed him and his insiders... Well, let me just turn that off, sorry.
No problem.
Okay, sorry about that. That would have allowed him, the wireless gaming system would have allowed a group of insiders who had the passwords to that wireless gaming system to be gambling on the body counts and the time of death of these various people, while the rest of the United States was trying to get its head around about who might have attacked it and why. You see, that's the fundamental diversion. What they did, what I believe Lutnick and Marcy did, and the other 2 that I'm coming to, is they distracted the attention of the United States military, law enforcement, and firefighters from locking down the crime scenes to preserve the evidence. So outside the Pentagon, you can see a row of people, many of them with FBI shirts, walking across the Pentagon lawn, picking up evidence and taking it away. That's a felony, Jason. It's called spoliation of evidence. It should be 5 years in jail. So the public at large was told this was an external terrorist attack. It was actually a domestic criminal attack, right? Where people inside the FBI and some of the conventional Army, Navy, Air Force were actually a party to this. Now, whether they were a willing or an unwilling partner, or a witting or unwitting partner, they were certain. Yes, there's a picture of the FBI on the scene. Now, outside the Pentagon, there's people with their FBI shirts, and for all I know, they were issued with FBI shirts when they left Abbotsford Airport the night before.
What's FBI WFOERT? We'll have to ask Robin Gritz.
Well, emergency response team.
Oh,
I
there
presume.
you go. Right, there you go. Now, David,
But
YouTube is reminding me that Robert Mueller was a Marine, and of course,
Correct.
people are reminding us that the United States Marine Corps is not criminal, and we aren't suggesting that. But of course, the possibility that rogues are operating within there cannot be discounted.
Well, you're absolutely right, and that's of course what they're relying on. If you're an external intelligence service, you want to get inside the most trusted group of people, and America is deservedly proud of its Marines. But again, what
Field
is Mueller
McConnell
doing?
is a Marine.
Exactly. What was Mueller doing? He was appointed director of the FBI
1 week before.
in the fifth, exactly. And then let's go through to the Amerithrax attack, right? Which is where letters containing anthrax bacteria from the Ames strain,
Right.
mixed with sabotage spore powder, was sent to a number of people who got inhalation anthrax and died. So that fell under the bailiwick of an ex-Marine, which is Robert Mueller. He had to start investigating. But now, here's where I think Mueller might be being blackmailed or extorted. In 2003 or 2004, Congress commissioned the National Academy of Public Administration to write a paper called The Transformation of the FBI.
Right.
You know who the secretary for that paper was?
I do believe it was Christine Marcy, because we've
Correct.
looked at it before.
Correct. So now what she advised is, or the National Academy of Public Administration, she advised, in order to thwart future attacks like 9/11, let's move 5,000 FBI agents from law enforcement and crime scene investigation to the prevention of terrorism.
Yeah.
So Mueller proudly announces, look how done. We're doing exactly what Congress and the National Academy of Public Administration has suggested. We're going to take 5,000 people away from crime scene investigation, including, presumably or possibly, the people who should have been investigating the Amerithrax attack.
Yeah.
Right? Now, as I understand it, Mueller had been discussing sending an FBI team to Porton Down in the United Kingdom, which had custody of the Ames strain of the anthrax bacteria, to see if any of that stuff had been smuggled out to participate in the 9/11 attack. He called it off. So they never went to Porton Down.
It's crazy.
So there we are. We got.
Yeah, I mean, I don't feel like it's a disjointed approach. I feel like you and I have fascinating conversations, and always interesting topics come up. I hate to cut our conversation short, but I do have a special double header today. We've got Laura Loomer coming on at 5. Laura has just discovered within the newly released Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department files information that reveals that the Las Vegas Metro PD knew there were 3 women with Paddock in his hotel room, and they knew that he had checked in 2 days prior to their initial official announcement of his check-in date. And you might recall, David, that Laura Loomer at a press conference demanded that Joe Lombardo address the fact that Paddock had checked in 2 days prior, and Laura basically forced the Metro PD there in Las Vegas to change their stories. So it should be a fascinating conversation with her. And David, if you're free next week, I would invite you back so we could continue this conversation and carry on with some of the other things that you're always looking into.
Okay, well, it's a pleasure, Jason. Thanks for having me on the show.
As always, and I just want to remind everyone, David, that they can follow your work more closely by going to abeldanger.org, and that's ABEL danger.org, and people can support the Abel Danger Worldwide Network through Patreon, and you can read David's daily briefings to General Kelly and learn more about Malaysian Air 370 and all of the fascinating topics that the guys there at Abel Danger dig into. David, thank you so much for joining me today. I will see you very soon. Oh, we lost your microphone there at the last moment.
I think I've been cut.
No, we've got
Okay,
you still.
all right, bye, Jason.
Take care, David. I'll speak to you soon. Thanks very much.
Yep.
And I
Bye
just
now.
want to remind everyone that Crowdsource the Truth is a community-sponsored news resource. And if you enjoy the conversations with people like David, and if you enjoy the reporting and the different shows that we're doing, please become a sponsor. It is very important, even $1, $5, $10 a month. You can become a monthly recurring sponsor at patreon.com/crowdsource the truth, and you can make a one-time sponsorship payment by going to paypal.me/crowdsource the truth. I'll be back very soon with a exclusive report from Laura Loomer about the new information in the recently released files from the Las Vegas Metro PD. Thanks everybody for watching.